really different people here on the stage, and you can tell that they're really great and experts in their fields, but we will find a common denominator among them, and that is future, and that is change. And can I please ask you, Mr. Barker, how do you stay fit in terms that you don't lose sight in the paradigm change? Because it's so hard sometimes to not be blinded yourself. You're a renowned author, everybody is listening to you, we do agree with you, but then how do you stay fit, not to be blind?
I think the simplest, most useful way to protect yourself from paradigm paralysis or paradigm blindness is to read broadly outside your field. Just as simple as that. Again and again, the breakthroughs start somewhere else and then work toward your industry. And so if I were to make any recommendation, I would say find yourself 15 sites or 15 publications that are substantially beyond your field of expertise and visit them regularly. Not necessarily every month, but regularly, and see what's going on there. That is a pliancy activity that will keep you open to new possibilities.
Mr. Seljak, do you do that? Do you have time? We were just listening about who are the managers and who are the leaders. And that the managers have responsibility now and the leaders have in the future. But do you have any time to be, because you're a manager and the leader at the same time, how do you find yourself in this reality to be leader, but being a manager as well?
Well, you know, in my perspective, it's not about whether you have time, but it's a question of the priorities for what do you take your time. And I was just thinking, actually listening to you about whether we do part of what you're saying also, out-of-box thinking and benchmarking with other industries. And actually in the technological field, being in the automotive industry and indoor well-being, construction, we are using lots of ideas right now from the aerospace, for example, and other branches which are very useful. But what is maybe very interesting also is that we put a lot more effort even, or as well, on the business model innovation, not just technological innovation, and fitting these two together in a very powerful tool. And in this respect, we are very much looking actually at all other industries than really ours, and we are applying these models from the other industries, definitely, yes.
Deepa, is the design paradigm change as well? If we were seeing and we heard the quotes for Steve Jobs, and one of the things how he changed our minds and view was also design. Do you think that's one of the important paradigm shifts or changes?
I absolutely think so, because I think design actually motivates behavior change. And I think that we also need to emphasize that intellect is important, but paradigm shifting and making an impact also begins a lot with empathy and just being awake. I think microloans are probably one of the great examples where this wasn't about intellect, it was about genuine empathy. And I think we shouldn't be too satisfied with observing trends, because you need to be able to go 10 levels deep and see, how do I help people cope with change? You know, for example, we all know that more couples are getting divorced. There are 2 working people in a household. There are more dads who want to spend time with their kids. Yet it seems to take 20 years to put a diaper change facility in the men's bathroom. When we decide to do it, it's a matter of putting 4 screws in a wall. But that requires not being satisfied with observing a trend, but being able to help people cope. And I think there's simple, elegant solutions to complex social changes sometimes.
Lucka, but you are seeing the trends, and you can tell by the trends that the world as a whole is not going to the right direction in terms of, it's a big question mark. Will we survive? And I don't want to be, you know, like spooky in this, but there is a question what the quality of life will be, and the trends are not good. What to do now? How to find a quick solution? And maybe just to add on, are we already in the sea level, what Mr. Barker explained? Is there a big crisis, so it's getting harder and harder, or not yet?
Yeah, well, all increasing trends are not always positive. I know that you are coming from the business world, but coming from the field of physics and specializing in environment, we actually have the problem you mentioned. it's boundary. And the planet Earth has boundaries, finite boundaries. So we would like to grow, business would like to grow, population actually grows, but planet doesn't grow. It's the best planet around. But so we have this problem of our game. We would like to play the game, but not within the boundaries. When I was a child, yeah, the dreams were allowed because we've seen rockets. The astronauts were flying to the moon, and it was just a question of time when we will inhabit Mars, to have additional ground to play on. But it did not happen. So now we know that that's all we've got. And actually, paradigm shift is something that we need on that level as well. And I was not very satisfied with your answer about how to change banks to behave differently. They are still looking for the paradigm. So is military industry looking still for a paradigm, because all they know is how to grow, make more wars. It's not very popular in globalized world, but when you do a big war, everybody loses in the end. So they are missing a paradigm. And actually, what Violeta said about this paradigms in our values, this shift is somehow missing from this picture. And I dare, maybe when I have a microphone, even to criticize a little, not Steve Jobs, but you know, all these paradigm shifts, they were made very, very smart. So there were times I only needed one computer. But because of the paradigm shift, I have now a computer in my office. Then I have, of course, Steve Jobs' tablet. But I have to have also my another computer, because I cannot plug my USB into Apple's one. So I ended up, because of paradigm shifts, with 3 times more computers. Same goes for the cars. Europe goes for electric car. But we will all need the classical one, because electrical one will not take me to the seashore and back. So where are some of these paradigm shifts leading the world? In the finite ground. So this game gets out of these boundaries, and that worries me.
Do you think that we are now... Do you think that we are between paradigms? Is that the thing why we don't have a single answer?
In not rebuttal, but in agreement, but expansion, we are in many places in transition. And the electric car is the beginning of the transition. We may end up with no cars before that transition is done. But I think your call for an understanding of planetary boundaries, what the actual limits of the planet are, is crucial, because some people have a pretty good sense of that. A lot of people do not. And so part of, I think, the technology will respond as we get that defined more thoughtfully. At least we've got a carbon footprint measure, and at least we've got a climate change sensitivity beginning to grow. We also have people who are trying to convince us that that's not true. So we are very much in transition on extremely important new rules for how to deal with the world in a successful way.
But we sometimes need a leader to make us feel more comfortable in terms of that we feel more safety. But is there a leader who can provide that? Deepa, what would you say?
I don't think it's also just a question of a single leader. I'm actually quite optimistic, because I see a few trends that give me hope. One is, first of all, we have more potential consumers than we ever had at any point in the world. So producing at that scale means that any company wanting to have a global reach will have to bake sustainability into their plans, whether or not that may be their current focus. If you want to reach China, India, all that, your supply chain issues will become very immediate. So sustainability will become part of your agenda automatically. You also have more channels to reach people than ever before, and more people, 5 billion cell phone connections people can exchange ideas, they can exchange all kinds of methods that they're using. And everyone has greater aspirations. So when that many people want to consume, they're going to find a way to do it in a way that satisfies their desire, but also does something for the planet. Because it used to be saying, well, if poor countries want to consume, everyone else's lifestyle will go down. That was the prevailing belief. I don't actually think that's true. What they found is really when people start to get to a per capita income of about $2,000 or more, those concerns come to those countries automatically, because suddenly they're saying, wow, I have some basics that I didn't have before, but I don't have clean air, I don't have that. So those concerns become global as opposed to one region really finding that they have to preach about these somewhere else. I look at it very simply. I mean, you're worried about the poor becoming consumers and the environmental disaster. I look at it the opposite. I said, well, if you want to learn about ethics, should we be looking to people whose livelihood is dependent on the community? If we want to talk about green, should we be talking to people who were farmers just a few years ago before they moved to the city? I think we have to maybe readjust our mindset, and the problem with scarcity is it often coexists with anxiety, lack of confidence. So I think if we focus on addressing those issues, a lot of solutions can come to the forefront.
And how do you find this? Do you think that we have more opportunities or we have more dangerous levels in the future?
Sure, I just think I share Deepa's optimism, but for slightly different reasons. I think that in the past there has been a fair bit of conflict between different groups in our society. People viewed us as just having two sectors, the business sector and the non-profit sector. Business often reacted to youth activists, dismissed youth as being really idealistic. And likewise, I think a lot of young people traditionally have viewed business as just seeking profits and viewing that as a bad thing. I think increasingly both parties are recognising that there isn't that division, and that often the best way to achieve a social return is to work through business. And often the best way to achieve a financial return, as Deepa touched on, is to engage consumers who are socially aware. But also I think sustainability is often linked into reducing costs. So because we are seeing greater alignment of social and financial returns, and I think that both parties are increasingly recognising that we're not playing against each other, that we're actually on the same team. And I think if we are on the same team, it is much easier to develop those innovations, to come up with those solutions. So yes, I'm optimistic.
Great. So I'm behaving like a waiter who never looks at your table. Now I'm looking at you. Is there any question at this point? Yeah, would anybody like to pose a question? Okay.
I have a question for did we all get the microphone?
Yeah, she's just coming. Could you please introduce
Thank
yourself?
you. I would like to ask Mr. My name is Blaž Sorjanic. I come from Slovenia. I would like to ask Mr. Baker. Barker, sorry.
But you can bake something, right? I started to do waiter, and now you're a baker.
Baker, Parker, Barker.
At the end of the day, the leader is on his own. He has to make a decision. In your presentation, you said there's an intuition in it, because he can rely on his team, but when he's called up for his decision, he can't say, okay, I made a decision based on the team. Are there any other tools than intuition when making this decision for the future? When you make an assessment, is that just another idea, or is this a new paradigm?
Let me speak to that in a funny way, because I made this point very specifically with the young people yesterday. When you are trying to join the development of a new paradigm, you're not the paradigm shifter themselves, but you're coming along with it. Typically, if you come in early, there are not enough problems solved to prove that you've made a wise decision. That's the intuition, okay? So there is a risk that you take if you're going to be an early adopter to a new paradigm that what I call the settlers don't have to take, because the settlers wait until the data is complete. The dilemma these days is, it used to be you could come in with a lot of money as a settler, buy up the land and do something. That doesn't look like it's working anymore. So there is an intuitive judgment you're going to have to make that you will not ever have enough data at that inflection point to say, boy, this is absolutely the right thing. Two dilemmas. with coming in early. One, you pick a paradigm that, as you said, doesn't go anywhere. It solved 15 problems, you thought, what a great deal, it solved 5 more, and that was it. So you didn't have a whole new territory to solve, it was a truncated idea that didn't go anywhere. Second thing is coming in too soon. I flew with a guy out to San Diego who had gotten a call from Apple inviting him to come out and show his apps to Apple. Now, I want you to understand what that, when Apple called him, he didn't call them. It wasn't a, can I come make a sales call? They said, would you please come out? So I said, how long have you been working on these apps? He said, oh, I actually started with them on Palm Pilot. And nobody wanted them. So I said, how long ago was it? He said, about 8 years ago. What did you do in the meantime? He said, oh, I started another business that kept me going so that when the true app business opened, I had these things ready to go. That's an example. Those are the 2 risks. Too soon, that's an absolute risk that you have to face, and a paradigm that looked good that turned out not to be a dead end, basically. Turned out to not have problem solved. So I wish there was a very clear way to take the measure. I've not seen one yet. So it's a risk business.
So when people are calling you, they must be aware and they must want to step out of their comfort zone. But it's really hard to step out of the comfort zone. Who does call you? Are there leaders, top leaders, CEOs, president of the management board? Who usually calls you?
Typically, middle or senior leaders. Once in a while, I will get a call from a supervisory council that has been given the power by the CEO to bring in their own speakers. Mm-hmm. But usually it's middle, upper. Okay,
but the decisions, Iztok, are made usually at the end of the day by the presidents of the board of CEOs. Who do you call when you need this kind of changing your mindset?
Well, first of all, I'd say that our attitude towards future, which is being mentioned so frequently today here, is that there is no future yet as of this moment. It's not something that exists, that is out there for the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years. And therefore it cannot be discovered in that sense, because this would be the work of a follower, I guess, if this would be the attitude and the approach. So our attitude is that it's all still to be created, to be at least co-created. It's not somewhere in the crystal ball, it's not on the first pages of the newspapers, obviously. There is something, but it's all the result of our passion about controlling maybe the future, as we are not even able to control our presence, obviously. So what we are trying to understand is really the factors that are going to influence that future. That is social, demographic, for sure, the resources, energy issues, ecological, legislative, and all the others, to figure out what that future very likely will demand from us to be creative, proactive, which is what we turn into technology roadmaps, as we call them in Hidria, for the next 10, 15 years, which is our innovation schedule, to which we dedicate the human competence resource.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Who is on the team? Who is there to
it's
define
the specialists in that level already from our institutes, which are developing these programs, and we are, for example, due with our new diesel code start system of the Euro 7 generation to be on the market in 2018 until 2025. And unless we have figured it until now, we know that we're out of business between 2018 and 2025. But this will be cannibalized by the electrical vehicles, so at the same time, and requires long let's say, breadth and very deep pockets as well. We need to cope with the hybrids and electrical vehicles. So we will be present in a super premium electric car with 4 times 100 kilowatt motor breech wheel in 2015, which will have the range of 300 kilometers, 400. So the technological advancement in terms of everything what has been heard about before. I was getting worried for a small second about the world with no cars, but this will take a bit more. Everything is going forward very fast, no doubt about it. So we turn this into reality, and we accompany this with a business model innovation roadmap as well. This is how we do things, but again, we involve suppliers, we involve customers, we involve university, we involve also the best specialists there exist globally in our field, but again also the people which are completely outside our field to have the out-of-box view of that.
I just want to make one observation. If you remember his early comment about there really isn't the future, but he's ready for 2018. I'm very impressed. You do think about the future, and it sounds like you do a great job of it.
Ms. Bogataj, you want to
I have
comment?
the same comment, but I also don't agree that we don't know nothing about the future. Because I'm a trained meteorologist, and actually what we did for the whole period of the study, you have to predict weather next day and the day after day. So yes, we can predict a lot of things for the future. That's the problem. Because talking about environment or planet again, we have some problems that will stay there forever. So we can predict that we will not solve the chemistry of the atmosphere. We can quite well predict that today we are 7 billions and at least 9 billions will be there in next 20 years. And we can predict that we will need, for that reason and for the changing of our lifestyle, 50% more energy, at least 50% more food, and we will need 30% more water. So I just think that, well, there are of course different assessments, but things will not go down. We will not be less people, we will not need less food or less water. So up to some extent, we have to be ready for this future.
So
just if I may make a very short point, because we completely agree. What I'm saying is that in our thinking framework model approach, we are taking this as the elements which are influence that future. But on the other hand, in that unknown element, it is what the exact answers to respond to these factors will be. Will it be an electrical car? Will it have a technological advancement that will allow us to have a hydrogen car on the road in the mass by 2020 if something really happens in between? If we are capable to do something, that it will happen, this is what remains open in that sense. I completely agree with this.
Ness, could you explain us what you do, how you kind of want to change the world, what kind of steps you take?
Sure. So Joel Barker made two good points, I think. Many good points, but two
I
of
would
them
say
were...
more, yeah, actually.
two of them were the importance of paradigm shifts and also the people who are best positioned to come up with those paradigm shifts. And I think he was right when he mentioned about youth and university students in particular coming at things with fresh ideas, and that there is a benefit in having less expertise because you can come in and ask those questions. So one of the things that I've tried to do over the past couple of years is provide an opportunity for university students to work with all types of socially conscious organisations, both non-profit, social enterprises, and also for-profit businesses to try to identify those paradigm shifts that both create social impact but also benefit the business as well. So I started 180 Degrees Consulting back in 2007, and I encountered a lot of the problems that Joel mentioned. A lot of people told me that university students couldn't consult for businesses, we didn't have the credibility, we didn't know what we were doing, it wouldn't work in Sydney, and it certainly wouldn't turn into an international organisation. And then over the past 5 years, I mean, I've encountered a lot of problems along the way. But I think looking back, when we look back and see that we've got now 12 branches around the world, another 10 or so setting up, we've worked with over 1,000 different businesses and organisations around the world. We've got really good feedback. I'm constantly getting emails from businesses thanking us for having university students come in and work with them. I think businesses are increasingly recognising that university students do have something to offer. And that something is coming in with fresh eyes to look at the problems that businesses are facing, to try to develop creative solutions to those challenges. And from a business perspective, often it's a case of you've got nothing to lose and potentially a lot to gain. You can have access to new ideas, and I think that it's therefore the business's role to select which paradigms they're going to act upon and which ones they're not. So that's one main way I've tried to be involved. But I've also tried to do some consulting work myself. One area of focus for me is an area called microinsurance. A lot of people have heard about microloans. Joel and Deepa both mentioned that. Microinsurance is a new area of microfinance, which is focused on trying to develop new ways of protecting the poor by developing insurance. And the traditional insurance model is you go to a consumer, often in person, you offer them a price for that insurance based on sort of the actuarial work that's happened behind the scenes, and then you pool those funds as a way of providing insurance. One thing that I'm working on is a venture called Insurers, which sort of challenges that paradigm in a few ways. Firstly, it offers peer-to-peer insurance, kind of following a Kiva-like model. So that's the first sort of main innovation. Second main innovation is linking it in with mobile banking. Mobile banking itself is a paradigm shift, particularly in East Africa, but linking that in and providing consumers with the opportunity to directly purchase insurance off their phone. And the third way is actually enabling consumers to actually set a price for their insurance rather than people just approaching them and saying, purchase insurance for $4.18, that's an actuarially fair rate. They have no idea how that was determined. So I think that having people like myself who might not have as much insurance expertise as some of the other people I'm working with at Oxford, but who can come in with a fresh mind to offer businesses new ways of doing things that they might not have thought of. So I do think there's a benefit there.
Deepa, when you travel around the world, you consult to different startups and multinational firms. And what Mr. Barker said, he said that in business you must listen. What do you hear when you go around the world? Do you hear the same problems or different problems? And of course, when you're consulting a startup and a multinational, what do you hear?
I think there's a lot more convergence than we believe in terms of the problems people are trying to address. I think whether people are in established markets or in emerging ones, there's a lot of the same issues, and I think that makes me quite hopeful. For example, when you're dealing with the poor, it's not absolute income that's a difficult problem to deal with. It's the issue of income volatility. Some people can afford something one year, and then if the monsoon is bad, they can't afford it the next year. But increasingly, with job insecurity in the West, income volatility is a reality on a global basis. The same thing, everyone talks about Apple making huge breakthroughs in usability because everyone from 1 to 91 likes to use that interface. But I think when you're trying to deal with poor countries, you actually have, for every product, you have to be able to deal with appealing to the breadwinner of the family, their parents, their children, and maybe their grandmother. So you have to have a multi-generational interface with low training and everything else because it's a lot of a group buying decision. So the idea of usability is huge no matter whether you're a multinational, whether you're a startup, NGO, whatever the issue is. People are time crunched. If you're poor, you have to work 3 jobs, and if you're rich and want to stay that way, you have to do the same thing. So it's a lot of these same issues, and I think that some companies are actually starting to realize that. It used to be that people felt like they needed a completely customized approach to every single company. Now there are a decent number of projects where people are saying the global middle class has a certain aesthetic sense, they have certain habits, because there is an evolution as income levels rise, there's a fairly predictable pattern. So I think there's a lot more convergence than people might realize, and I think everyone has the same issue of, am I staying relevant? Am I demanding too much behavior change? Because I think what all great companies do is just something very simple. They really are able to drive that fine line between helping people deal with their desire to evolve, but also managing force of habit. And that's where the really good innovations are. And I think we just have to keep that in mind, whoever we're dealing with. And also not only decide what we think other people's needs are, but deeply understand their aspirations.
Mr. Barker mentioned that it's important that you kind of give your challenges and problems out there and you listen to others. And there are many business people here in the audience, so you have opportunity now. And who will be the first one who will get this opportunity to tell your challenges and questions, problems. And you have these great people up here and in the audience who can maybe find a solution. So is there anybody who would like to share the challenge that you think about? Sonia?
Thank you a lot. First, I would like to, that I admire all the panelists. It's a great debate, and we're proud, Lucka and Iztok, to have you here, that you're Slovenes presenting in this panel. Joel, thank you for researching the future. Nat, thank you for being the future. And Deepa, a question for you, and also a bit of a challenge, as we were challenged now by Ajsa. Microloans was mentioned a few times. Maybe it's the word that was mentioned beside challenge and future, and what leaders the most today. And within that paradigm that happened, I see there are two things. First is that when it happened, it opened our minds, or minds of a lot of people and businesses, to the poor. The poor suddenly became a group of consumers, and that changed a lot for a lot of industries. But also, at one point that was not mentioned, but is important for the success of microloans, was that first they started as an idea, but it developed when it was turned to women. It was women who made microloans successful. So, are women a paradigm shift? Which is probably a bit of a strange question, because I know that from Adam and Eve we were supposed to be together. But are women happening as something new to the society and also to the trends that are coming up?
Thank you, Sonia.
I think the women ought to answer.
Of course, I'm going to say yes, but but I think it's evolving, and I think there's a lot of people who can cite on both sides. There's a lot of studies that show this model, it really worked because you were lending to a group, and this idea of not losing your face, being part of the community is what made it work. It's hard to say. I'm not as much of an expert on microloans. I would like to maybe have this but in many other, there are a lot of cultural shifts that are traced to women, but it's hard to say, because there's a lot of things that say once you reach certain income levels, there's also studies that go the other way that said behavior starts to really correlate more to rank in life and your position rather than your gender. So very difficult to make a generalization there.
I might make one comment. One interesting thing about microloans and how Muhammad Yunus rolled it out is that a lot of the resistance to the adoption of that actually came from women. When he was initially going around selling the loans, it was women who said, no, we don't touch money, that's the husband's business. And actually changing the mindset of the beneficiaries is often a challenge as well that we wouldn't often expect.
You also said that you cannot say that young people will find a paradigm shift or will tell us where to go, nor old, not maybe...
As I said, or gender.
Or gender, yes.
A good friend of mine went to a conference in India. He was invited to speak on world peace, and he's got a project that's extremely interesting on it. But he was asked a question after his presentation. He said, if there's one thing you could do that changed the world dramatically for the better, what would it be? And he said, empower the other 50%.
Okay.
I think that's the answer. We've got to get everybody involved.
Is there a problem sometimes that young people think that old or older people are the other 50%, what we heard? Is that a problem?
I'm of that age, yes, I think that's true. we older folk can have good ideas too.
Okay. So do we have any business challenge that you wanna? Yeah, we do.
Hello, I'm Ware. And my question to you is, I don't think it's a matter so much of finding paradigm shifts, especially with the internet today and the exposure to media. I think it's more of a matter of choosing which paradigm shifts you get involved in. And I would like Joel to hear Joel's experience on that, because the problem is, especially at university, when things evolve so rapidly, especially how Nad was mentioning, and when you're in a consultancy, you get exposed to so many industries, so many new ideas, you always have a choice. The question is, what should you go for? Should you go for your gut? Should you go for what you like? Or should you go for what you're best at? Or the one that you actually risk less? Which is your advice?
I'll start on that one, but I'm sure others have. I have this little quadrant that I left out today, but I go through this, which is keep your paradigm, keep your customer. Keep your paradigm, change your customer. Change your paradigm, keep your customer for another reason. Change your paradigm, change your customer. Those are increasingly more difficult. So part of the dilemma of changing paradigms, for instance, think about changing your paradigm, changing your customer, and trying to be successful in that. So there are different ways to approach this that make it more risky or less risky. And the one I have seen most often is keep my paradigm, change my customer. Because that is the least internal change I have to do. I go out and look for something. And by the way, Deluxe Check Company did that. They were able to say, okay, we've been making all these checks for all these corporations for all these years, and that's going away. We still want to make checks. Who can we sell to now that we never even considered before? For those people, it was a big deal to have Deluxe Check offering this whole new service. From their point of view, it allowed them to hang on to their paradigm and practice it longer. So that would be, at least that's a start to answer to your question. Then maybe we have some more comments.
Deepa, I think in terms of coping with paradigm shifts or even changes that need to happen, part of it is designing systems that make that behavior change a lot easier for people. I mean, I'll give you an example from India. In the 1950s and 60s, they didn't have organized dairy production. It was a huge problem. There was a huge problem with malnourishment because people used to have the milk that was bought wasn't reliable. People used to go around with cows and milk cows, and they would always add water, dirty water. People would get sick. And they said, we don't have the money to set up commercial dairies. And there was a simple innovation from the town near where I was born, where this guy said, we have to stop paying milk producers based on the volume of milk. Let's pay them based on the fat content of their milk. There is absolutely no incentive then to contaminate the milk, to add anything. And what happened was people were actually started to take much better care of their animals because they knew that that would translate into more income. And it really became a point of pride for farmers to say, I supply to Amul Dairy because I can tell people I'm an honest business person. There was a pride in doing that. And these cooperatives were copied across the country, and within a very short period of time, in about 20 years, it became, India is actually the world's largest milk producer. Ice cream, cheese used to be considered a luxury and taxed as one. Millions of people have access to clean food because of something so simple. So the problem might be very complex, the stakes might be high, but I think when it comes to these shifts, these changes, even we know we need to make, making that behavior change as simple as possible is something that we have to really focus on.
Iztok?
Just because I think we're kind of creating new paradigms ourselves here in a very positive way, because this involvement of the woman, not because of the cheap populism, but because of a certain, I would say, balance in the nature, is something that we need to use because we are, in a positive sense, different, and we need differences to produce new quality. So this is, I think, the one thing. The other thing, which is, I guess, worth mentioning, what we're discussing here, is that it is about time to make a shift in our heads about the renewables, about the zero-emission society which is coming, because we are still taking it as a threat, I feel, even through this discussion, which is not the case. Because it is a huge opportunity, and each threat which you can see all the time, you can still change into the opportunity. And for us, it's a huge business, even in the cogeneration, tri-generation, photovoltaics, thermosolar, geothermal, which is we are putting together now to have solar cooling systems on the market in 2030 and on. So when we think this in our heads, it will be a great step forward as well. And I think what I was mentioning before about the future not being there yet, I was just trying to say that when we are saying it's there, we also agree that it's going to be kind of created somehow, it's a motion by somebody else. And as long as it's going to be created just by somebody else, I'm really getting worried about that future, because today's leaders in politics and somewhere else, in terms of the credibility, it's worrying me. But as long as it is in our hands, and I'm profoundly sure it is in our hands, because the situation which we are facing now with the crisis needs to be resolved by great steps in the innovation, technical, technological, and business models. And as long as it is in our hands, I'm sure it will be a positive one. I'm confident.
Right,
okay, I can comment on the involvement of women. Yeah, for sure. If I would be a business leader, I will always ask and empower women where we are talking about long-term decisions, because women are great on long-term. But on short-term, I think men are the fighters, so they go and fight. But on the long-term, technically, I would bet on women always.
Oh, you are risking now. You have a lot of women there.
You told us we should make this round table more vivid. And maybe what you said, if you have to choose among many paradigms, or if you're in a doubt, researchers, university researchers, we all often are at these crossroads. And I would, maybe it doesn't work for everybody, but it always worked for me. It's time to listen to your intuition, or put it in the women's way, listen to the heart.
So do we have anybody who listens to the mind and the heart and wants to pose the question? Yeah, we have 3 actually.
Thank you. My name is Bojana Zupanic. I come from the company Denfos. And first I would like to thank organizers for inviting us to be partners with this business forum, because I'm pretty sure that me and all of my colleagues from the company feel a little bit more relaxed now, going out of the ordinary work and coming back with fresh new ideas. And to my question, I would like to go back a little bit to this leadership role, because after all, this is a business forum, and I would like to hear your opinion on looking, I don't know, 15, 20 years from now, when this youth will be our leaders. How will this leadership role be changed in 15, 20 years from now? What is going to happen with the practices like performance management or teamwork or all these kind of things that exist right now on a workplace?
I think already we're seeing that some of the most successful companies are the ones that are most innovative in relation to performance. I mean, even Google allows their employees to spend 20% of their time working on the project of their choice that can be completely unrelated to their main job. And I think that that's something that's pretty hard to measure, because every different project will have different metrics that you go by. But in terms of leadership, I think a few trends are emerging. Firstly, related to sort of the increasing focus on creativity is a decrease in the hierarchy in a lot of organizations. I think the top-down management structure isn't as conducive to innovation, and it's not as conducive to a good environment for employees, which is becoming increasingly important. And so from a leadership perspective, which relates to what we were talking about at the start actually, I think one important thing is not so much for the leaders to be the ones to come up with those paradigm shifts. So I don't think there's necessarily that conflict between how you spend your time. I think it's more about leaders just being open to the possibility of completely changing the direction of the organization, or be open to suggestions that employees may have.
Well, I'd like to speak to that just and offer an alternative to that, because I work with 3M. They are very hierarchical. They are very creative. So it's not just a structure that is an is or an isn't. It's that attitude that you were talking about inside, because they were one of the very first to free up their researchers, you know, for 1 day a week to do whatever they wanted to do. Now, by the way, there was an interesting, how can I frame this? The guy who's now head of Boeing was head of 3M. Yeah, he was head of 3M for about 14 months, I think. Anyway, when he came in, he said, you know this thing about this 1 day a week thing, you can do whatever you want? He said, I'm going to apply Six Sigma to that, and so what you're going to have to do, if you want to do that, you're going to have to tell me what it is that you're going to come up with, and put this set of criteria on that meant you had to tell him in advance of what you were going to discover. Literally, innovation in those 14 months dried up in 3M because of this leader putting in these kinds of requirements that closed down the process. When he left, the new CEO, who was a great guy, came in and his first speech to the people who had this free time, he said, by the way, you know those criteria, just throw them out. You know, let's get back to business.
Do you do something like that?
In my view, of course, leadership somehow is always context dependent. But I guess long-term looking, our context is still looking for growth, looking for something better, looking in a very positive sense for contributing to a better world. And if this is the case, leadership, I think, still will be a lot about charisma. It will be about drawing this picture of the better world, a realistic one, and attracting everybody who is with us to understand that, to take it as their own, and bring in the competence, of course, and capabilities to make it true. And in that sense, I think we are out of the hierarchical relationships. We're into the project management. We are into the task forces. We are into the leading leaders, which is what I have around. And I'm just first among the equal. And I think this is positive as well. And I think this is also the crowd which is going to be a part of these leaders. And this is the future that we are facing here today. And at this point, I will also say that it's, of course, also time to take the space, to take the spot, to raise the voice, because the future that we are discussing here about is actually, it is your future. So you also need to decide about it. You need to say, what do you think this future should be like? Raise the voice, and we are here to hear you and to include you as much as possible, and as soon as possible.
Do you think the business people are listening to you? I want to hear the youth now. Do they? I don't mean in particular this panelist, but do they listen to you? Or do you not speak? I hope they do listen and they do speak. So we have 2 more questions, I think. Yes, please.
My name is Amadea Dubovišek. I'm coming from Slovenia. I would just like to add something about whether is it possible to change or to choose in which paradigm shift we are going to take part in. Let us remember into the marketing field, and we know that basically companies exist because they want to market, because they want to sell. And a big paradigm shift has been from transactional marketing to relationship marketing. And what we are facing today is that companies actually know that they have customers who would basically prefer to work with companies on the basis of the relationship. But the leaders manage and lead their workers, their employees, actually in accordance with the old paradigm shift. Do you understand what I mean? We actually, as a company, as a leader, we accept new paradigm, but we lead and manage people in accordance with the old paradigm. And in the marketing field, here it has been noticed a big problem, when we talk about the success of the companies. Thank you.
Deepa, would you go ahead with it?
I'm not sure I completely understood the question. So.
I think it was that at one level they're practicing the transactional relationship, at another level they're not, and what does that do to the organization? Was that the essence of the question?
So the problem was, the question was, whether do you see there is a problem when a company accepts one paradigm but manage and lead
people with
another paradigm?
I think you're partly touching on the issue of organizational culture, and I think that's something that's incredibly difficult to change. At business school you hear the word culture thrown around all the time, but I think few people recognize just how important it is. And I think if you look at the most successful companies, they're often the ones that have been started with a set culture where everyone who comes into the firm buys into that culture and almost self-selects into that environment. So I think the paradigms which challenge the culture of a firm are going to be very difficult to get buy-in across the board and to change it in the way that you seek.
Let me give an illustration of that. I was working with a food company in Minneapolis, and we were having them write the rules of their paradigm. It was the R&D department. And you always get about the first 30 rules are out of the book. And then somebody tosses out a rule that's not written down, and everybody goes, oh yeah, that's right. And then all of a sudden, it just explodes with all these unwritten rules. So I was working through this, and the room was set up in an interesting way. We had the technicians over here, and all the PhDs were over here, right? And one of the technicians raised his hand, and he said, okay, here's a rule. Only PhDs can have new ideas. So I looked over at the PhDs, and they had this kind of smug look on their face. That's right, that's the way it is. So I turned back to this guy and I said, well, what happens if you have a new idea? He said, oh, you wouldn't believe it. He said, we got to feed those PhDs one little piece at a time until they finally figure it out themselves. And I looked over at the PhDs, and you cannot believe the expression on their faces Like, oh my God, that they did that to me, didn't they? That's a culture thing. Inside the R&D, the culture was, if you're a PhD, you can have an idea. So by the way, we changed the rule. We said everybody has a right to have an idea about anything they want to. And we were able to drive that into the structure, and it absolutely made a difference in the rate of innovation and the ideas that came out. But initially, there's your barrier, there's your conflict between something that should have been easy to do and the culture rules that said, you gotta have a PhD.
Lucka, sometimes when you go around and you tell us what do you see, not as somebody with a magic ball, but somebody who can see in terms of even the really trends, we kind of feel, oh my gosh, she's telling us this, we don't want to step out of our comfort zone, we want to live in this, and I guess it's happening in the businesses as well. But what do you think is the solution? Do you have any idea how to change everything?
Well, I'm looking at the solution, actually. I think that a lot of paradigms, now I will use that word as well, I don't really know all the meanings of that, it's a very magic word. Will change with the young generation because they are aware of the problems, but they may not be aware about the solution. But they have this feeling that we cannot go on like this. We didn't figure out that question for 20 or 40 years, but you know that. You know the problem, and then when you know it, you're halfway to solve it. So in a way, I am optimistic. And we were talking about Facebook, about all these connections, especially is being made by young generation. I don't know a lot of 60 years old that would do Facebook. So actually you can do this shift if you have a good idea, if you have a good thought, like you do in this competition. I think this can be done very quickly. And great ideas are cheap. Actually, in my view, it's just the way how we put our priorities. Because we were taught wrong what our priorities are. And actually, later when it was too late, when it's very hard then to change the habits, I'm not so optimistic like you are that it's easy to change the habits of people. It's not so easy. It's actually very hard. But when you start young, when you start exchange, when you have this feeling that actually, we are, now I'm getting a bit philosophical, but we were I generation, what matters for me. But you should be we generation. You should define what we is, because we could not do it in time. So we will leave you a lot of problems behind. But if you define new we, that you're winners.
Deepa, you have your great legacy of your father, and you also have two cultures of a legacy. I guess you have a broader view on this, and how do you see it? How do you live in one world and in another world, and both is home? And do you think that this interdependence that Mrs. Bogataj mentioned is the one that is leading toward solutions?
I think it's the luxury I've had is, I guess, and having an immigrant experience, going back and forth, I can travel. It does give you, I think, a lack of presumption about where change can come from. And I mean, I'll also make another contrarian point about innovation is that I will never argue against youth and passion and energy, but I think diversity means also just accepting the people who may seem a bit cranky and impatient, because if everyone was passionate about washing dishes, we wouldn't have dishwashers. So, you have to really kind of look out and say, why is somebody not interested in this idea? Why are they completely unmoved by it? And that's the only way you can broaden the impact of what you have. Otherwise, you're preaching to the choir all the time, and that is not really how you can create impact. So you have to be a little bit flexible about the means and probably be much more rigid about your values and a little bit more flexible about your means.
Thank you. So today, the last question. Oh, now you all have questions. No more questions? Okay, but I said the last one. No? Okay, you see, I have the power of no more questions down there. But I must tell you that I'm really truly proud today that I'm Slovene, because Andrea is Slovene and she's a founder and the president of Challenge Future. And please give a big applause to Andrea. Also because she brought these great people on the stage to tell us a lot. So thank you very much to all of you, and the future is there. We can kind of sense it, although it's in our hands and in hands of everybody to do it the right way. Thank you very much. And